There's a particular recognition that settles in when you realize how others have learned to approach you. Not the sharp awareness of being manipulated or the clear understanding of being taken advantage of, but something more subtle. You begin to notice that people enter interactions with you differently than they do with others. They come with a certain confidence, a particular ease, an assumption that things will work out in their favor. This awareness isn't dramatic. It's the quiet understanding that your predictability has become their advantage. You might first notice it in how requests are framed when directed toward you. Not demands or ultimatums, but suggestions presented with an underlying certainty that you'll find a way to accommodate them. The tone is respectful, even considerate, but there's something beneath it, an expectation that your response will be reasonable, which means it will be yes, eventually in some form. This expectation didn't develop overnight. It built through countless small interactions where you demonstrated your willingness to find middle ground, to see other perspectives, to prioritize collective harmony over individual preference. Each time you compromised, each time you accommodated, each time you found a way to make something work, you were teaching others how to approach you in the future. The teaching happened without intention on your part and without conscious learning on theirs. It was simply the natural result of consistent behavior, creating predictable outcomes. When people learned that approaching you with problems led to solutions, that bringing you conflicts led to resolutions, that presenting you with difficulties led to accommodations, they began to rely on these patterns. Consider how this unfolds in the most routine circumstances. A colleague mentions they're struggling with their workload, and somehow the conversation naturally progresses toward you taking on additional responsibilities. Not through direct request or obvious manipulation, but through a process that feels collaborative. They share their challenges, you express understanding, you begin to see ways you could help, and eventually you find yourself volunteering to shoulder part of their burden. Or perhaps a friend expresses disappointment about plans that aren't working out, and you find yourself reshaping your own schedule to accommodate their needs. They don't ask you to change your plans, they simply share their frustration, and your reasonable nature compels you to find solutions. By the conversation's end, you've adjusted your commitments to make their situation work better, and it feels like the natural, caring thing to do. Maybe family members discuss logistical challenges around holidays or gatherings, and you automatically begin calculating how you could modify your own arrangements to ease their complications. They're not pressuring you to change your plans. They're simply thinking out loud about their difficulties. But your consistent pattern of finding ways to help means that your flexibility becomes part of their problem-solving process. These interactions create a subtle but persistent dynamic where your adaptability becomes integrated into others' planning. They don't consciously think we can count on them to adjust, but they unconsciously factor your flexibility into their decision-making. Your willingness to accommodate becomes a resource they can access, a variable they can manipulate, a constant they can depend upon. The reasonable person experiences this as being helpful and valued. They're the one people turn to when situations get complicated. They're the one others trust to find solutions when problems arise. This feels like recognition of their emotional intelligence, their problem-solving abilities, their commitment to making things work. They don't recognize that they've become a tool in others' arsenals, a means to others' ends. Meanwhile, others in the same environment learn different lessons about how to navigate social and professional situations. They observe that taking firm positions often leads to favorable outcomes, that expressing strong preferences usually results in accommodation from others, that being less flexible doesn't result in social punishment or relationship damage. They don't become unreasonable or demanding, but they become more comfortable advocating for themselves, more willing to let others do the adjusting. This creates an invisible hierarchy that operates independently of formal authority structures or explicit power dynamics. It's a hierarchy of adjustment, where some people consistently adapt their preferences, schedules, and plans to accommodate others, while others consistently receive that adaptation. The reasonable person finds themselves at the bottom of this hierarchy, not through any dramatic demotion or obvious subjugation, but through the simple mathematics of who bends and who remains rigid. The cost becomes apparent in seemingly insignificant moments that accumulate over time. When restaurant choices are being made for group dinners, when meeting times are being scheduled for projects, When vacation dates are being coordinated among friends, the reasonable person's preferences carry less weight in the decision making process. Not because others actively dismiss those preferences, but because everyone unconsciously knows those preferences are negotiable, malleable, subject to revision. This dynamic extends beyond simple logistics into more substantial territory. The reasonable person's opinions begin to carry less influence in group discussions and decision making processes. Not because their ideas are inferior or their insights less valuable, but because their contributions are presented as starting points for negotiation rather than positions to be seriously considered and potentially adopted. Others learn to treat their input as flexible, as something that will evolve and adapt through discussion, rather than something that deserves careful consideration in its original form. The reasonable person often interprets this diminished influence as evidence that others value their collaborative spirit and diplomatic approach. They see themselves as facilitators who help groups reach consensus, as individuals who prioritize collective harmony over personal agenda, as people who understand that good relationships require give and take. This interpretation contains truth, but it's incomplete. They are facilitating, but they're facilitating their own marginalization. They are prioritizing harmony, but they're doing so at the expense of their own voice and influence. What makes this dynamic particularly insidious is that the reasonable person's behavior is genuinely admirable and socially valuable in many contexts. Their willingness to compromise does make groups function more smoothly. Their flexibility does reduce conflict and tension. Their accommodation does solve practical problems and prevent unnecessary friction. The behavior itself isn't problematic. The problem lies in how social systems respond to and exploit that behavior over time. The reasonable person becomes trapped by their own competence at being reasonable. Each successful compromise reinforces others' expectations of future compromise. Each graceful accommodation establishes precedent for future accommodation. Each demonstration of flexibility creates demand for continued flexibility. They become prisoners of their own emotional intelligence, constrained by their own maturity and wisdom. Others don't consciously exploit this dynamic, but they unconsciously depend on it. The reasonable person becomes part of the infrastructure of social functioning, like reliable internet service or well-maintained public transportation. Essential for smooth operation, noticed when absent, but largely taken for granted when present. Their predictability becomes so integrated into others' planning that alternatives aren't even considered. The reasonable person begins to sense something is fundamentally wrong when they start noticing the asymmetry in accommodation patterns. Not because they're keeping careful score of who gives and who takes, but because the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. They find themselves constantly adjusting their schedules, modifying their preferences, and revising their plans to accommodate others, while those same others seem to maintain their own commitments and desires with little modification or compromise. This recognition brings a particular type of exhaustion that's difficult to articulate or justify. Not the exhaustion that comes from obvious conflict or dramatic confrontation, but the fatigue that results from perpetual flexibility. It's the weariness that accumulates from being the variable in everyone else's equation, the adjustable component in every social calculation, the person whose needs can always be worked around and whose preferences can always be modified. The exhaustion intensifies when the reasonable person realizes how their adaptability has been systematically leveraged by others, not through malicious intent or conscious manipulation, but through the natural human tendency to take the path of least resistance. When people need flexibility, they know where to find it. When situations require someone to absorb inconvenience, they know who will absorb it gracefully. When problems need solving, they know who will find solutions that don't require others to change. Yet even recognizing this pattern doesn't immediately suggest a clear path forward. The reasonable person can't simply abandon their capacity for compromise without losing something essential about their identity and values. They can't suddenly become inflexible without transforming into someone they don't want to be. They can't stop being accommodating without violating their own sense of what it means to be a good person, a good friend, a good colleague, a good family member. This creates a profound psychological bind. The reasonable person is trapped between their authentic values and the consequences of living those values consistently. They're caught between who they genuinely are and how others have learned to treat who they are. They face the impossible choice between maintaining their integrity and protecting their interests, between being true to themselves and preventing others from taking advantage of that truth. The hidden cost of always being reasonable reveals itself not as dramatic exploitation or obvious abuse, but as systematic irrelevance. Others don't take advantage of the reasonable person so much as they stop needing to consider them. The reasonable person's predictable flexibility removes them from the equation of others' decision-making processes, not through malice or conscious exclusion, but through simple efficiency and convenience. Why factor someone into your planning when you know they'll factor themselves out? Why consider someone's preferences when you know those preferences will adapt to accommodate yours? Why worry about someone's needs when you know they'll find ways to meet those needs that don't inconvenience you? The reasonable person's greatest strength becomes the mechanism of their own invisibility. This is how fundamentally good people gradually disappear from their own lives. Not through dramatic betrayal or obvious exploitation, but through the quiet mathematics of social interaction. Through the simple recognition that some people will always find ways to make things work, which means others never have to. Through the understanding that some people can be counted on to adjust, which means others can be counted on not to. The reasonable person sits with this recognition, seeing clearly how their most admirable qualities became the instruments of their own marginalization, how their emotional intelligence became emotional servitude, how their maturity became manipulation vulnerability, how their wisdom became willingness to be overlooked. The understanding brings no immediate relief, no obvious solution, no clear path toward change. Instead, it brings the heavy knowledge of how thoroughly and invisibly the architecture of their social relationships has been constructed around their predictability. How what felt like being valued was actually being utilized. How what seemed like being trusted was actually being taken for granted. How what appeared to be respect was actually the comfortable assumption that they would always be reasonable, which meant they would always accommodate, which meant they would always lose. The weight of this understanding settles in slowly, carrying with it the uncomfortable clarity of seeing a pattern that can no longer be unseen, and the disturbing knowledge that recognizing the pattern doesn't automatically provide the power to change it.